Edward Bloom has told several fantastical stories of his adventures, but his skeptical son wants to know which of his father's life is real or fiction. In Alabama, a fish that was never caught was dubbed as the Beast. Some say the fish was the ghost of a thief who drowned in the river, so Edward Bloom thought that if this were true, then it would want gold. On the day his son was born, he used his gold wedding ring as bait, and the beast quickly grabbed it. Edward tells the story through the years on many occasions, including at his son's wedding reception. His son, Will, however, has grown tired of this story, so he walks out of his own party. As his wife, Sandra, walks to him, Edward finishes his speech by comparing it to marriage. He says that the only way to catch an uncatchable woman is to offer her a wedding ring. This earns him applause from the audience. Outside, however, Will confronts his father about the story. Edward thinks he's allowed to talk about his son at his wedding, but Will points out that he's merely a footnote in that story. He argues that he hates the story after hearing it 1,000 times. After that night, the two didn't speak for 3 years. Will believes that he and his father are just different. From all the stories he's heard about his father, he's not sure which is fact or fiction. One day, however, Will learns that his father's chemotherapy isn't working, so his pregnant wife, Josephine, urges him to visit. With that, they fly to Alabama. During the flight, Will watches a young man make shadow puppets, reminding him of when his father used to make them for him and how Edward told Will the story of a witch. In Ashton, he and his friends, Don and Zachy, went to a swamp where a witch with a glass eye lived. Edward doubted that she was even a witch, so Don dared him to steal her eye, which was rumored to show how a person dies. Accepting the challenge, he approached the house, and before he could knock, the witch opened the door. Soon, Edward returned to his friends, but he brought the witch with him. She removed her eye patch, and Zachy saw himself falling off a ladder as an old man, while Don saw himself as a young adult having a heart attack. Scared, the two ran away. Afterward, Edward helped the witch back to her house. He shared that he worried that seeing how he'd die would ruin his mind. Still, he considered that knowing would assure him that he'll survive everything else, so he decided that he'd like to know. The witch opened her eye patch, and the young man nodded at what he saw. At present, Will and Josephine arrive at his parents' house, where they find Dr. Bennett visiting. Soon, Will goes to his father's room and greets him for the first time since his wedding. The weekend Edward thinks everyone is worrying too much since he already knows this isn't how he will die. To challenge this, Will asks what he saw in the witch's eye, but Edward says it's a surprise. His son asks for true versions of his stories, but Edward changes the topic. He comments that he doesn't like being confined, so dying is the worst thing that's happened to him. Will thought he said he wasn't dying, but Edward clarifies that he meant this isn't how he'll go because the last part is more unusual. As Will heads out, he passes by his old bedroom, remembering when he was sick in bed as a kid. To comfort him, Edward told him the story of when he found himself growing rapidly. Since his muscles and bones couldn't keep up, he spent 3 years in bed, strapped to a machine to help his body. One day, he read about how a goldfish can grow up to quadruple its size if not confined in a fishbowl. This made him think that his growth spurt meant he was meant for bigger things. When his growth spurt evened out, he became a star athlete, a mogul in the grass mowing industry, won science fairs, and rescued a dog from a fire. This made him the biggest thing in Ashton until a stranger arrived and ate sheep in the middle of the night. The next day, a mob demanded that the mayor deal with the stranger, but Edward volunteered to do it. Edward went to the cave, where he met the giant, Carl. Knowing that this wasn't how he'd die, Edward claimed that he volunteered to be the town's human sacrifice. The giant refused to eat him, though he admitted that he got too hungry because he was too big. Edward suggested that the town might be too small for him, so he advised him to move to a big city. However, Carl figured that he was trying to get him to leave. Edward admitted that he did, but he also wanted to go with him because the town was too small for his ambition. This convinced the giant to join him. As they left Ashton, Edward dared to take a supposedly haunted road to see if the story was real. He went alone while the giant took the safer route so they could meet on the other side. While walking down the foggy road, a crow stole his hat. Edward threw a stone at it, but accidentally hit a beehive. After running away, he found a warning sign for jumping spiders. Despite that, he took the path and discovered the idyllic town of Spectre. The mayor approached him and found his name on a list, claiming that he had arrived too early. He introduced Edward to the last person from Ashton who came there, Norther Winslow. As they ate, a little girl named Jenny stole Edward's shoes and threw them out of his reach. Despite this, Norther and the others assured him that it was all right. Edward stayed to understand the strange place. At night, he saw a young woman bathing in the lake, but a snake was approaching her. He swam and snatched the snake, only for the woman to dive into the water and for the snake to turn into a branch. Jenny met him by the shore, telling him that the woman was a fish no one had caught. As they walked back to town, Jenny pointed out that even if he were 10 years older than her, their age wouldn't matter when they were both old. They returned to town and found that they were having a party. The mayor's wife wife shared that Jenny liked him, and Edward realized what was happening. He announced that he wanted to leave as he wasn't ready to settle down in one place. This surprised them as no one ever left their town, but Edward was determined, so he bid them goodbye. Before he left, Jenny asked him to return and he promised that he would. Despite having no shoes on, Edward traversed into the dark path. During this, a mystical tree grabbed him, but when he remembered that this wasn't how he'd die, the tree freed him. Eventually, Edward met up with Carl at the end of the road. At present, the Bloom family is having dinner when Will announces that the photos Josephine took in Morocco were published in Newsweek. Sandra congratulates her, but Edward just tells his daughter-in-law that African parents only speak French, and they talk about everything except religion because it's rude. The woman merely smiles at his story. That evening, Josephine checks on her father-in-law. He shares that he was dreaming but only remembers his dream when it was meant to happen. Once, he dreamed about a crow who warned him that his aunt would die. The next day, it came true. When the crow told him that his father was going to die, his father kept waiting for something to happen to him. Instead, however, their milkman died because he was his real father. The story amuses Josephine. She then shares about his photos during their wedding, and Edward reveals that he didn't have pictures of his own wedding since Sandra was engaged to someone else. After leaving Spectre, Edward and Carl arrived at the Calloway Circus. The ringmaster, Amos Calloway, presented their giant, Colossus. The crowd was awed by him until Carl, who was twice his size, stepped in. Surprised, the circus workers quickly ended the show to avoid the awkwardness. As the crowd shuffled to the exit, Edward saw the young Sandra for the first time. Meeting the love of his life felt like time had stopped for him. When time moved again, it went so fast that Edward couldn't catch up to the woman. As Amos offered Carl a job in the circus, Edward returned and shared that he saw the woman he was going to marry but lost her. Fortunately, Amos recognized the girl, but he warned him that she was out of his league. Edward complained that the ringmaster didn't know him, but Amos figured that he was big in a small town, but in the real world, he was nothing. Still, he planned to find the woman, so Edward negotiated to work for free if the ringmaster told him who the woman was. With that, Amos promised to tell him something about her every month he worked, and Edward accepted. From that day on, Edward performed many tasks around the circus. After the first month, Amos told him that the woman he was looking for loved daffodils. The following month, Edward learned that she was going to college. Next, he learned that she liked music. After 3 years, Edward had to know something to help him find the woman, so he checked Amos's trailer only for a wolf to attack him. This only stopped when he threw a stick, which the canine fetched. Realizing that it only needed social niceties, he played with the wolf. By morning, he found out that the wolf was Amos, who was a werewolf. Given how he treated him in his wolf form, Amos finally told him Sandra's name and that she went to Auburn for college. Giddy, Edward thanked the man and rushed away. He went to Auburn in a nice suit and prepared daffodils before finally meeting Sandra. However, she was already engaged to his old friend, Dawn. Heartbroken, Edward apologized before leaving. He found it cruel that the love of his life was marrying the biggest jerks from his hometown. Despite this, he was determined to marry Sandra. For days, Edward expressed his love for her in various ways. He even filled the field outside her house with daffodils. This gesture impressed Sandra, but Dawn arrived, so the woman asked Edward not to harm her fiancé. Recognizing him, Dawn punched Edward for talking to his fiancé. Edward didn't fight back as he promised Sandra, so Dawn beat him. However, all the physical activity led to his heart attack later that day, as the witch prophesied years ago. Before then, Sandra broke up with Dawn after seeing his cruelty and married Edward instead. After hearing this story, Josephine pours water for her father-in-law, wondering why he's always thirsty. Edward claims that he's always been that way. Unbeknownst to them, Will overhears them talking, so he sits quietly outside to listen. As Edward was recovering from his injuries from Dawn, he was suddenly drafted into the military. He was expected to serve for 3 years, but he took hazardous assignments to return to Sandra sooner. He accepted a secret mission to steal the plans from the enemy. While the opposing army watched the performance of conjoined twins Ping and Jing, Edward infiltrated backstage. Upon arriving at a military tent, he used night vision goggles to defeat the soldiers in the dark. Finally, he got the documents, but the show ended, revealing his parachute over the curtains. The twins discovered him in their dressing room. He described his love for Sandra to convince them to help him escape. Understanding his desire to return to his wife, they agreed to help, and in exchange, he promised to introduce them to a man who could give them a show in America. However, the army believed Edward to be dead as they lost contact with him. Sandra was broken over the news until her husband finally returned 4 months later. The next morning, in the present day, Josephine shares Edward's story with her husband, but Will believes those were fantasies. His father was mostly gone throughout his childhood, making him think that he had another family. Whatever the reason is, Will thinks Edward is attached to his stories because he's bored with life. Later, Will talks to his father privately. He complains that he doesn't know his father because he never told him anything real, calling his story amusing lies. Since he's about to be a father, he wants to know the real versions of Edward's stories. Edward insists that his stories are real, so Will walks out. That afternoon, Will helps his mother clean Edward's office. There, Sandra finds the letter from the army that claimed her husband was dead. Surprised, Will checks it, and Sandra tells him that his father's stories aren't all lies. Reading the letter, Will recalls the next part of the story. After the war, Edward worked as a traveling salesman, and he chanced upon Norther in a bank in Texas. After Edward left Spectre, Norther realized that there was more to life outside, so he began traveling. However, to support this lifestyle, he became a robber, so he declared a robbery in the bank. Norther forced Edward to help him, but a bank teller revealed that their vault was empty. After escaping, Edward explained to his friend that the bank lost money due to real estate prices and the lax enforcement of the fiduciary process. This convinced Norther that the real money was in Wall Street. He eventually became a wealthy broker and sent Edward a check to thank him. This allowed him to buy their dream home. Presently, Sandra finds Edward in the bathtub, who says he was drying out. She joins him but breaks down in tears at the thought of losing her husband. Meanwhile, Will checks the rest of Edward's old documents and finds a deed of trust from Jennifer Hill. He goes to the address, passing by a sign that welcomes him to Spectre. There, he meets Jennifer and bluntly asks if she was his father's mistress. She asks why he didn't ask Edward, so the young man explains that he's dying. This surprises Jennifer, so she refuses to say anything that can skew his view of his father. Will insists on knowing the truth, so Jennifer tells him the second time Edward arrived at Spectre. He was heading home but hit a thunderstorm so great that it sent him underwater. It was when he saw the woman in the lake again. By morning, he arrived at Spectre, which grew dilapidated after a new road was built, sending them banks, liens, and debt. An auction was held to buy the town's properties, and Edward bought the entire town. To pay for it, he asked help from the people whose fortune improved because of him: Norther, Amos, and the twins. He allowed the residents to stay for free as he only wanted to keep their town alive. Soon, he bought every property except for Jennifer's, who was dubious about the agreement. Edward insisted that she won't lose her house, but Jennifer revealed that she was just disappointed because he didn't return sooner. This was when he realized that Jennifer was the young Jenny. Despite her refusal to sell her property, Edward kept returning to fix her house. Soon, Jennifer's house was so beautiful, and her feelings for him grew. However, Edward rejected her because he loved his wife. Despite her broken heart, she finally signed the deed for him to thank the man for helping her. With that, Edward left Spectre and never returned. As years passed, Jennifer's house grew old and dilapidated, thus becoming the witch's house where Edward's story began. Will knows this is contradictory because the witch was old when his father was young. Jennifer reminded him that she loved a man who couldn't love her back, but she still wanted to be important in his life. That's why she became a story, while his life with Sandra and Will was real. Later, Will returns home only to find the place empty. He soon finds Josephine in the hospital, explaining that Edward had a stroke earlier. That evening, Will offers to watch over his father so his mother can rest. Before going home, Sandra sits by her husband's side and tearfully holds his hand. Later that night, Dr. Bennett finds Will at his father's bedside and shares the real story of his birth. A neighbor brought Sandra to the hospital since Edward was away for business. It was a perfect delivery, and his father regretted not being there for it. The story isn't as exciting as the one Edward tells, so Dr. Bennett admits that he prefers the one with the big fish. In the middle of the night, Will sees his father waking up. He tries to tend to him, but Edward only asks him to tell him how he goes. Despite not having learned what his father saw in the witch's eye, Will understands what his father needs, so he makes up a new story. One morning, Will wakes up in the hospital and sees that Edward is feeling better. Edward insists on going out, so Will grabs the wheelchair and helps him escape. The orderlies chase them, but luckily, Sandra and Josephine arrive from the elevator. The women stall the orderlies while the father and son escape, and Edward instructs him to go to the river. They race through the streets but end up in traffic, so Carl helps clear the road. Finally, they reach the river, and everybody in Edward's stories happily greets them. Will carries his father into the water, where Edward gives his wife his wedding ring. As soon as Will drops him in the water, Edward turns into the beast. In reality, Edward Bloom passes away quietly in his hospital bed. Soon, everyone gathers for Edward's funeral, including Amos, Carl, Ping, Jing, and Norther. After the funeral, the people in Edward's stories share their tales with one another. Years later, Will's son recounts his grandfather's adventures to his friends. Will has accepted them as part of their lives, knowing that despite them being laced with fantasy, they were still the story of his father's life. Thus, Edward lives on, immortalized in his wondrous tales.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.